I actually moved from Chicago to Petersburg, Virginia in 2004, and when I moved to Petersburg, Virginia, I learned to say, "How y'all doing?" Because, you got to do that. So I hope y'all are doing well. I am delighted, excited, and a little daunted by the size of this crowd this afternoon, and I'm excited to be here at the school, and I want to thank Dr. Williams and Dean Rutherford for inviting me down here to the Clinton School to be both a visiting scholar and to have the opportunity to be here with you today. I have to say that the Clinton School is really an exciting institution, and I've spent a lot of time working, thinking about philanthropy, writing about philanthropy, working with foundations and donors, and I haven't yet seen an institution that so perfectly captures the intersection of public service and philanthropy, and that really starts with a definition of philanthropy that has the community at the center. And so you're really to be congratulated for that. Most people don't start by defining philanthropy that way, but we certainly are trying to encourage more people to do so. So it's a really exciting place to be. I'm delighted to be a part of it and to add my 2 cents to the discussion here about philanthropy. One of the things we were joking about back in the room here was kind of the size of the crowd. And she mentioned the $282 billion. And so anybody who came here to find out where that $282 billion is, I'm going to disappoint you. What I am here to talk about, though, is a topic that is really central both to the Council on Foundations, but really the broader body of work that I've been involved with in philanthropy. And that has to do with vulnerable populations and community philanthropy. As a visiting scholar, I've been here all week, and I was asked to consider the role of community philanthropy and vulnerable populations. And I'm going to spend some of my time today talking about that, but I'd really like to start off with a much simpler idea, and that's the idea of giving. And more specifically, I want to talk about 6 different ways that one can think about the act of giving. I was walking down the street last night thinking about this presentation, trying to kind of get my head around the ideas that I wanted to share with you, and my hotel is just across the street from the Clinton Museum store. And so I was kind of walking by there, and I stopped, and I saw 2 signs on the door. One said giving, and the other one said give. And this kind of light bulb went off, because those words are so important. I work in the field of philanthropy with foundations. We do a lot of work that talks about strategic philanthropy and community philanthropy and strategic giving. But the word giving is much more accessible for people. Everyone can find themselves in that concept, and that language is really important. And most of what I want to spend my time talking about today has to do with how people find themselves in the idea of giving, and how you create institutions that allow themselves to find themselves there. So that language connotes a lot of things. Most people think about philanthropy and they think about people like Andrew Carnegie, and we're going to kind of turn back to him for a moment. But most people don't necessarily imagine themselves as philanthropists. But I want you to all both imagine yourselves as philanthropists, but to think about giving. And within that one word, all of those complex ideas about strategy and about being sophisticated and partnering with community are all embedded in it, but it's a much more accessible concept. So there's a basic construct to the idea of giving that I want to start us off with today, and that is that giving has 2 parties. It has a giver and a receiver. If I'm a giver, I'm giving something, you're a receiver, you receive it. And if you don't have both of those things, you don't really have a giving transaction going on. You've got something else going on. But this simple idea that there's a giver and a receiver is really at the heart of one of the more complex ideas that makes philanthropy both challenging and rewarding and complicated. The relationship is all tied up between kind of who's the giver, who's the receiver. Who gets to decide what the receiver gets? Is there an equal exchange, or is one person giving something and the other person receiving? Is it ever a reciprocal relationship? Giving is an expression of humanity, but it is also an expression of power. And so when you think about giving and givers and receivers, it's important to kind of keep that dynamic in mind. There's a good friend of mine, Elizabeth Lynn, who's a scholar who runs a program called the Project for Civic Reflection in Indiana at Valparaiso University. And she's written a piece in 2006 that kind of pulls together a framework of giving that I want to share with you a little bit. And it offers up 4 of the 6 definitions of giving that I want to talk to you about this afternoon. She defines the 4 traditions of philanthropy as charity, improvement, reform, and engagement. Each emerged from a different historical context and time. Each contains a different nature of relationship between the giver and the receiver. And it's important to say that each of these 4 concepts is necessary, good, and important. The charity tradition of giving is offered to solve kind of an immediate problem. There is a disaster, people need something to survive, whether that's food, shelter, whatever. There's a giving impulse, and it's kind of immediately applied to the receiver. They get something to solve that problem. The challenge with this model, of course, is that the next day, someone else or that same person will need something, and the system can kind of replicate itself. The improvement tradition is the second tradition, and it grew out of a desire to help those that wanted to help improve themselves. This is what is most typically aligned with the idea of Andrew Carnegie, that one needed a system or a systematic approach to give, to help those who wanted to help themselves, to kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps, to get to that ladder and climb up. So it's more of a hand up than a handout. And Andrew Carnegie started this movement that really not only lasted for a century, but continues to persist today. Generations have benefited from scholarships and programs and libraries and institutions that were designed to help people bridge the gap between what they had and what they needed to realize their potential. There's also limits to this model. The giver in this model has control over the improvements that are resourced. The giver is often the decider. They determine what improvements are worth investing in. And sometimes that depends on what appeals to that person. It can be limiting if it doesn't invite a conversation with others about what is wanted or needed by the person on the receiving end. Andrew Carnegie very famously gave Princeton University a gift. He went to the campus, was walking around with the president. I think the president of the university was Wilson at the time. And, you know, visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. They had no idea what this man was going to do. Does anybody know what he gave them? He gave them a lake, a man-made lake. He gave them a lake because he wanted to encourage the young men of Princeton to row, because he detested the idea of football. That was his idea of what the university needed. Now, it doesn't have to play out that way. There's another story that has to do with Paul Allen, who's one of the dudes that started Microsoft, incredibly wealthy in Seattle. And he was personally enamored of Jimi Hendrix. And as his wealth grew and he wanted to give back to the city, the idea that took root for him was a Jimi Hendrix museum. And while that had a lot of personal appeal, and he has a huge collection of Jimi Hendrix memorabilia, the city expressed a desire to do something different. We needed something bigger. We needed something that would invite people to imagine music and sound and innovation. And what the city ended up with was the Experience Music Project, I think it's EMP. But he allowed his vision to be transformed by ideas of others, and it turned into something else. The other thing about this kind of improvement notion that's important to spend a little time on is that improvements may or may not be available to everyone. And so if you think about the first idea of giving a man a fish, then this one is obviously teaching a man to fish. But what if the man can't get to a pond? What if the man can't walk? What if the man doesn't have a car? What if that pond isn't for people like that? And so there are structural reasons why improvements sometimes don't reach everyone that they could reach, and that others don't benefit from them. So that's a second idea about giving. The third idea of giving has to do with reform. And so whereas these others kind of approached giving from kind of an individual and an institutional sort of a way, reform took up the notion that we need to solve the base problem. We need to figure out the root cause. That man could be standing by the river, fishing all day, nothing's happening. Somebody's got to figure out why there are no fish in the river. And so kind of what is the process by which we determine kind of the larger structural problems at play, and how does philanthropy and giving attach itself to solving those problems? We see a lot of evidence of this kind of giving throughout the field of philanthropy, particularly in foundations that have tackled huge social problems, whether those are education, environment, health. They want to understand the connection between cause and effect. They fund a lot of research and a lot of advocacy work, and ultimately this work is aimed at changing policies and really embedding social change. In her article, Elizabeth Lynn, as she lays out these 4 traditions, talks too about the dangers of this particular approach, and she suggests that there can be downsides here. And those downsides come about when those on the giving side of the equation determine the agenda, when they are advocating for the change and not necessarily working with the community to define that change. So that leads us to the 4th kind of giving, and that has to do with engagement. And in this model, she presumes that the giver and the receiver are kind of together at a table, working to both define the problem and describe the ways to solve it. The act of giving and giving together here is not just a transfer of resources, but it's an act of engagement. People sitting down at a table together, defining a problem, bringing the right stakeholders to a table, will come up with a better solution. There are downsides to this one too, right? This is messy. It is complicated. The more people you bring to the table, the more you really have to arbitrate between kind of what the right solution is. If there's no fish in that river, is it because the company down the way is dumping something into the river, and if they're at the table, they're not going to want to change that, and someone else is going to want to change the public policy, and the foundation may or may not want to do any of those things. And so it's a complicated picture to come up with a community version of change. So those are the first 4 versions. As I said before, all of those traditions are good and necessary, and each is active, alive, and powerful, and most of them are embedded in what we think about when we think about philanthropy and foundations. It is the work that my members do every day. It falls along that entire continuum. There are small foundations that give when there's an urgent need. There are foundations that give scholarships. There are likely those of you in this room that give along those 2 dimensions. There are other foundations here in Arkansas that are working on school reform, and others that are working in communities all across the region to really build a different version of change that engages lots more people across the board. So I want to kind of put those 4 aside and call them mainstream philanthropy. The one thing that I want to note about those 4 traditions before I move on to the next 2 is that in each there's a distance between the giver and the receiver. Even when a foundation is reaching out to engage the community in its work, it's the foundation that gives the money and the community that receives. It's a community that asks for a grant and a foundation that gives it. It may be a foundation that sets a table to figure out what sorts of reforms are needed, what sorts of advocacy are required, what sorts of research needs to be done. But there is a distance between the 2 that's really important to take note of. There's a 5th type of giving that closes this distance, and that's where I want to spend the rest of my time. This giving has to do when the giving impetus is generated from the inside of a community rather than from the outside. I'm going to propose that we call this indigenous philanthropy in order to distinguish it from mainstream philanthropy. It's another piece of the puzzle coming out of very different traditions and responding to very different motivations. Here, the donors and the community are one and the same. Givers are in the community, foundations and giving are rooted in and led by the community. The target population is both giver and receiver. To begin to talk about this tradition, I want to introduce you to a few organizations you've probably never heard of. The Cherokee Preservation Foundation, based in North Carolina, grew out of a settlement which many Native foundations did, where they decided to take those assets that grew either out of a public contract, a public claim, or a different sort of public settlement, and turn that into philanthropic capital. There are about 54 Native-led foundations across the U.S. Some of them are small and grassroots, others are very large, endowed institutions that support a variety of causes. My friend Mike Roberts runs something called the First Nations Development Institute, and he reminds me that there are no more vulnerable populations in the United States per capita than Native Americans. And it drives him nuts that most people think of Native philanthropy and casino philanthropy in the same sentence. And so I'm going to do myself a favor and tell you the difference between Native philanthropy and casino philanthropy. He's written an article, he's actually published a lot with us lately. He published an article with us called Indian Giver. And in that, he details that casino philanthropy generates a certain amount of money, but if you were to pay out that money per capita to each Native American in the United States, you would bring that population up to 50% of the poverty level. So, we're talking about a community that has enormous needs, profound resource challenges, but has found ways through Cherokee Foundation and other foundations to convert what they have into philanthropy that they lead and direct in their own communities. The Hispanic Foundation of Kansas City. It's another foundation. It started off as an affiliate of a community foundation there. Started by a guy named Ramon Murguia. And Ramon recognized that there was a growing Latino population in Kansas City, and they had no vehicle, no place where they saw themselves as having a vehicle to give, to express their giving to things that they cared about, where they saw themselves being active. So he started one. They got a seed grant from the Kansas City Community Foundation. They started this affiliate fund, and it's been operating for more than 20 years very successfully. What's really interesting about this particular model is that they've grown from just giving scholarships to really rooting out and supporting a diverse group of grantees that serve Latino populations throughout that region. Their grantees have become the grantees of the Kansas City Community Foundation. Ramon moved from that board to the board of the Kansas City Community Foundation. He now sits on the board of the Kellogg Foundation, which is one of the larger national foundations across the country. It is not just an act of giving, it is an act of leadership and change that that foundation is focused on. The third foundation that I wanted to mention was the Asian Pacific Foundation. It's based in San Francisco. It recognizes that there's 1.4 million Asians in the Bay Area. They make up 23% of the population. They receive about 1% of all the grants that flow through that community. So what do? They set up their own foundation. They recognized that that was a community that had both needs and assets, and they wanted to create an institution where those could be expressed equally. And so they worked with the community to identify Asian-led and Asian-supporting nonprofit organizations. They provide grants to those institutions, but just as importantly, they have the same very complex and sophisticated vehicles to help their donors to manifest their philanthropy within that institution. And so they do donor-advised funds, they do all the sorts of things that other community foundations do. The third thing that they do that's really important, and that a lot of these funds do, is that they hold up a mirror. They do research, they do publicity, they do awards. It is so important for these communities to be able to hold up to themselves and to others and say, you know what, we give too. We have assets within this community. We want you to know that we are equal to you, whoever else is giving money, in terms of our desire to help our community, and we found all sorts of ways to do it. And that's a really important piece of the puzzle. I was privileged to do some research about this a couple of years ago, and there's some research that's just come out by the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors about these kinds of funds. And one of the things that these funds do, in addition to giving and finding nonprofits and supporting their capacity, is really elevating the practice of indigenous giving. The fourth foundation I want to bring your attention to is something called the Black Belt Community Foundation, which is in Selma, Alabama. And it's a really interesting model because they've got one of the best mottos ever. Their motto is, take what we have to make what we take what we have to make what we need. They have corporate donors, they have community donors, and everybody has an equal seat at that table. They created an institution and set a table whereby everyone had to be welcome. And this was through a long, very deliberate process of bringing the local banks, the local community leaders, the local agents, the local mothers, the local PTA. The woman who started this is a fabulous journalist. Her name is Carol Zippert. And Carol talks about Miss Isola. And she's like, Miss Isola walks up in there, she doesn't know anything about a foundation. She just wants to give to her community. And this has to be a place where she can sit next to the president of the local bank, and they have both bought equal seats at that table. Now, the way that they've structured that varies. Sometimes the bank will start a donor advised fund for $10,000. A local community or a set of block clubs will agree to raise that amount of money. They don't have to give it, but they have to raise it. Everybody has some skin in the game, and everybody buys equal seats at that table. And what they are committed to doing is to create a vehicle to engage that whole community and all of its resources and all of its leadership to improve the Black Belt of Alabama. The last example that I wanted to give you is an organization called Semillas. And Semillas is a women's fund that's based in Mexico City. It was founded in 1990. And it is one of 145 women's funds across the country and across the globe that belong to something called the Women's Funding Network. That family of funds collectively gives away $60 million a year. It recognizes the power, the resources, the urgency, and the insights that women bring to solving the problems of women and girls. And they do it with a particular focus, a particular clarity, and as women, they get it done. And so each of these local funds takes up the issues that they consider important. They catalyze the dollars. They've just successfully completed a fundraising campaign where they raised more than $150 million, $1 million at a time, because they recognize that women have assets. And in the future, they're going to be really important. And at Semillas, what they focus on is human rights, labor rights, economic advancement, sexual and reproductive rights, and violence against women. And they are very focused and very successful. And as I said, there are 144 funds just like them across the world. Those 5 funds really give you a sense of the characteristics of some of what I'm calling indigenous philanthropy. As I mentioned a second ago, Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors has done a study that's not yet released where they found about 400 of these funds of various types across the United States. And that doesn't include funds that are either incorporated outside of the U.S. or where the funds flow from the U.S. abroad. And there are huge funds where that's true. There's the American India Fund. There are a number of funds that support parts of the Caribbean and Africa where local populations, non-residents, are sending millions of dollars to support their local communities abroad. But the funds that they found range from giving circles that may pool together $100 or $1,000 or $500,000 to major institutions that are independent foundations that give away better than $1 million, $2 million, $3 million a year. They are long-standing traditions that have been organized into philanthropy. Each one of those communities that I described have been here for centuries. They have been giving this way for a very long time. And now they are starting over the last 30 years really to organize into philanthropic vehicles so that they can both express that philanthropy strategically, but also be an equal partner with what we understand to be philanthropy that grew out of that Carnegie model. They were formed out of a couple of reasons. One was need. When many of them were formed, and some of them were formed as much as 30 or 40 years ago, they were formed because there was no place to express philanthropy if you weren't from the mainstream. The Black United Fund was formed. It's a series of workplace giving funds, for example, when workers wanted to give through their workplace giving, but the organizations that they could choose to give to didn't reflect their interest. And they wanted to be able to give, but they wanted to be able to give to organizations that they cared about. And so it started out of a need and a desire to express giving in a very particular way. This sort of giving activates philanthropy differently. It recognizes that different donors have different experiences, different motives, and different things that they care about. A lot of people describe in kind of the racial and ethnic giving communities the desire to give to organizations without which I would not be where I am today. And I can stand here as one of those people that without that scholarship and without that support from a community organization, I would not be here today. And so it's very important for me to be able to give back to those kinds of organizations. My husband gives to 2 institutions. One of them is the high school that allowed him to move out of a public high school system into a Jesuit system and advance the rest of his education. It changed his life. And those are the kinds of things that give particularly vulnerable populations access to opportunity and equality that don't necessarily exist without it. And I want to stop here and mention, because I know that Charlotte will kill me if I don't, an emphasis on vulnerable populations. Because it's almost a given with this type of giving that these models, by definition, advance the cause of serving vulnerable populations. It is who they are. It is who they were. They claim vulnerable populations in a way that mainstream communities can't. Those are my people. They are alumni of those communities, and giving back to them is profoundly important, but it is direct and it is personal. There's a great foundation in LA called the Liberty Hill Foundation. Liberty Hill gives to social change, it gives to small grassroots organizations, it gives to kind of all of those really good things, community organizers. They used to do something, and I don't know if they still do it, called van tours, where they would kind of take their groups of donors together out into the community to see the work that they were doing. The idea there was that they needed to close the distance between their donors and the work on the ground. And we had this conversation with them one day a couple of years ago, and it went something like this. What if you're taking people back to where they live every day? How does that change the dynamic of what it is that you do? How do you accommodate a philanthropy that not only assumes people from the outside are giving, but that assumes people from the inside are giving? There is a lived experience that goes along with this kind of grant making that makes it very powerful. People within communities know leaders, they know solutions, they know where the bodies are buried, they know what's been tried, they know the organizations that may put on a good game but aren't really doing anything, and they know the leaders that other people won't take a risk and invest in, but that are really worth investing in. The other thing that sets these organizations apart is that they are specifically focused, almost to the foundation, with growing the leadership and the capacity of the community at the same time that they give. Giving is a tool, but it is not the end. Giving is a way to practice civic engagement. It is a way to grow leaders. It is a way to grow givers. It is a way to support nonprofit institutions, to find nonprofit institutions, validate them, and hopefully hold them up so that other funders will find them. But it is a huge act that goes way beyond giving. The total giving that is encapsulated by these groups, at least as far as the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors was able to come up with, is about $200 million a year. That's a small amount in the scheme of things. All foundation giving, according to the Foundation Center, is about $45 billion in any year. But it's also important to remember that most foundations, the typical foundation in the United States, gives away less than $100,000 a year. Now, there is a very powerful cluster at the top, but everybody else gives just like these folks do. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that, I guess the sixth way of giving that I wanted to mention, excuse me, is that when you pair up indigenous philanthropy and mainstream philanthropy, that's what I want to kind of count as the sixth philanthropic way. When you find a way to do that together, there's even greater power, particularly when you think about that 200 million versus the 45 billion. There's lots of ways to leverage what people know and what they bring to the table and the kind of skin that they have in a game. But it's important to pair those up in a way, and there's some really good examples of how that's been paired up, that has really transformed how giving happens in communities. When it's worked, it equalizes the biggest foundation and the smallest indigenous fund as equals. Everybody is a giver, everybody is a receiver, everybody has some money on the table, everybody has some skin in the game. I want to give you two examples of where that's happened that are really powerful, and a colleague at the table over there, Charisse, mentioned that this is the 4th anniversary, I think, of Katrina. And one of the examples I want to give you is for a foundation called the 21st Century Foundation, which is based in New York. It's an independent foundation. It's been around for a couple of decades, originally founded by a man who seeded it with an endowment gift of $1 million, African-American gentleman, in order to grow a philanthropic institution where other African-Americans and others could give to African-American communities. And when Katrina hit, the 21st Century Foundation was kind of uniquely suited and on the ground in ways to do work that no other foundation could. They had relationships, because they work nationally, with small, unknown, unseen groups across the Gulf that could do all of those kinds of philanthropy that I described before. They could find people who needed immediate relief. They could find people who needed assistance in order to move from one house to the next. They could find organizations that were doing the kind of long-term organizing that wasn't just focused on the immediate, but also on what kind of communities New Orleans needed to rebuild once that was all over. They are still doing that work on the ground today. But what allowed them to do that was the fact that they could pick up the phone and call 5 small community organizations down there that nobody had ever heard of. But because they were that foundation, they were able to do 2 things. A, they attracted money from African-American donors all across the country that wanted to give to their Katrina Fund, because those donors knew that those dollars weren't going to go to the Red Cross, which did fantastic work, but flew way above the radar of these organizations that I'm describing. The second thing that it was able to do was to attract dollars from other foundations who needed the kind of agent on the ground that the 21st Century Foundation represented. It's a very important partnership that showed how you can combine mainstream philanthropy and indigenous philanthropy to really solve a problem where everybody was equal, everybody had something to give, and that 21st Century Foundation had a real unique asset to provide in order to get the solutions resourced that needed to be resourced. One of the more interesting things that they've done, to give you an example of some of the work, if you might remember that there was a St. Bernard parish in the greater Gulf area that came under scrutiny because it was extremely segregated. And one of the things that happened in the aftermath of Katrina was a desire for new residents to move into that community because there was space, because there was land, because there was housing. And there was actual litigation that needed to happen in order to enable people that weren't related by birth to St. Bernard Parish residents to be able to move into that community. That's the kind of work that 21st Century Foundation funded through the Lawyers Committee under Civil Rights to make a difference on the ground in Katrina. There are very few foundations across the country from afar that would be able to identify and respond to those kinds of needs. The other organization that I wanted to bring up is an organization called Trust Africa, and you're going to have Suzanne Siskel here next week, and so I'm setting her up. And the reason I want to bring them up is because it's one of the ways that a partnership from a large foundation can seed something really powerful. So the Ford Foundation and several others identified, because they've worked on the ground in Africa for many decades, a need to really catalyze local philanthropy. So they put some seed money on the ground, allowed that project to incubate within Ford, and then launched it a couple of years ago. The Trust Africa is now a real catalyst for African philanthropy. They're doing a lot of things. They're both doing grant making. They're doing the kind of catalyst work to seed local philanthropy. They're doing that research that I described to put a face and a number and an exponential on what it means to give in Africa and to really be able to describe that qualitatively. And when I looked at their website, I was really interested to see what they described as their mission, and I want to read it to you. They say they want to align external philanthropic resources with African agendas, as well as cultivate indigenous resources that support the continent's own priorities. They want to minimize the dependence of civil society organizations on external donors. Now, that's a mission that is shared by many of these other foundations that I've described to you that are indigenous. They see growing philanthropy as a tool, as a long-term strategy to support the vulnerable populations that they serve. They know that long-term dependence is not a strategy. They know that self-determination is part of the puzzle. And they're dedicated to applying those tools and their agendas and attracting external resources, if in fact those external resources are willing to be applied to the things that they define as important. There is tremendous potential in this hybrid model, where you blend resources and expertise, where people have deliberately shared grantees between foundations, they've shared grant knowledge, where what partners have to bring is equally valued, whether you are Miss Isola and your block club has raised $1,000, or you're the bank president, or you're Trust Africa and you've attracted dollars from Ford American Express, that everybody at that table has something to give, and everybody at that table has something to receive. And it is understood that no one has everything, and everyone has something. I want you to know about these models for a couple of reasons. One is that they are often invisible, and I do hope that if nothing else, I've told you about some organizations that I think are profoundly powerful, doing work in their own way all across the globe. It kind of flips this notion of giver and receiver on its head. But I also wanted to spend time talking about it because it's important to note that what it takes for these two kinds of organizations to work together is instructive for any conversation about community philanthropy. Though I've talked about it briefly and I've kind of illuminated a couple of models, I don't want to underscore that this is really hard work. What it takes for mainstream and indigenous philanthropy to work together holds lessons for any kind of community engagement exercise, and so I want to share some of those with you briefly. One, I want to go back to this idea that I raised earlier that philanthropy, this kind of giving and receiving relationship, is ultimately about power. And when you talk about combining and partnering and having two sets of people with two different sets of resources and power come together, those have to be shared. You're sharing the power to give, to decide who's important, to decide what's important, to decide what gets resourced, to decide what doesn't get resourced. Somebody has to be able to make those decisions. And when you're bringing people together to make them together jointly, you have to be willing to change your idea. I don't think that the Trust Africa mission statement is by default. I think it's very deliberate. It says it wants to find people willing to support Africa's agenda. It doesn't say that, you've got your money, you want to bring it here, we'll let you do what you want. They have a very deliberate point of view about what needs to change on that continent, and it's informed by lots of people, lots of research, lots of resources. And they want to attract resources to that idea. When one organization has money, it's an imperfect kind of power equation. When several organizations have money and they all put them on the table, that changes the dynamic, and that's part of the power of this model, but it's also what makes it complicated. The second thing that I want to mention is that the substitution of judgment is a very difficult thing. In philanthropy, and particularly in philanthropic institutions and major foundations, they are all about ultimately making a decision about who gets what. And your role as a grant maker, the kind of body of experience, your whole kind of body of expertise is kind of tied up in this notion that you're going to try to make the best judgment that you can about what to do with those resources. We all have limited resources. You have a real responsibility to preserve them and act as prudently as you can. When you blend that with someone else, you're actually inviting a substitution of judgment. You may, in fact, have to say, take this money, do what you think is best. I had somebody describe to me who worked at a community foundation completely, it was all mainstream arts organization fund, and she described that the hardest thing that organization ever grappled with was giving a $20,000 grant to a community with no strings attached. They just gave the grant and said, you decide what's best to do with it. We want you to figure it out. It is that kind of substitution of judgment that really cuts across what philanthropy is about, how the traditions have evolved. It is very different from what Andrew Carnegie did. The third thing that I want to mention in terms of kind of an instructive lesson is that to include others in the work means that you have to be prepared to change something because of it. If you give to your environment and you're a mainstream institution and you're supporting trees, and I kind of did this work in Seattle a couple of years ago, where there was a group that was really interested in kind of engaging a more diverse set of donors, and they were deeply invested in the environment. And we had this conversation one day where somebody realized that the people they wanted to attract may not want to support those trees. They may, in fact, be really concerned about environmental justice. They may, in fact, be really worried about the fact that landfills tend to get sited in poor, vulnerable populations and in those communities higher than they get sited anywhere else. And that they would, in fact, have to change how they did their grant making if they were to invite people to the table. Jim Joseph, who was the president of the Council of Foundations, the organization that I now have the privilege to work in, once said that arrogance was the original sin of philanthropy. It is something that I tell people all the time, and so now I've told you. And it is because one of the most powerful things that's embedded in this model is the freedom and the willingness and the honesty to say 3 words. I don't know. Maybe 3 other words. You tell me. But it is not knowing that makes this really uncomfortable for most people. It is not having kind of the power to decide because you need to trust someone else's judgment. It is the ability to be in a learning mode rather than a deciding mode. The last thing that I wanted to mention before I close up is, particularly because there are students here, I wanted to give them 5 questions to kind of ask of themselves as they go about this work. As I mentioned before, the school has a really powerful program that intersects philanthropy and public service, and you have the opportunity, and in fact, I think you probably came here, to really pick up this charge of working with communities. And I want you to at least think about these ideas as you continue your work doing that. The first question that I want you to ask yourself as you go out and do your work is, how can I approach a community and ask, what does it have, rather than asking, what does it need? Even communities that appear to have nothing have a long tradition of making a way out of no way. They do what Carol Zippert described as taking what they have to make what they need. But you have to have that openness to see that there are assets as well as needs in a community. The second thing is, how do you approach a community with humility and curiosity? How do you wonder who knows what you need to know and go find them? 3, as much as we attend to seeding strategy and programs and policy and change and activism, is giving also one of the tools that we use? I want to leave you with the idea that this work is incomplete if you aren't thinking about how you grow and invest in leadership and philanthropy, because that's what you leave behind. That's what communities use to continuously reinvent themselves, to invest in change, to invest in the next generation of leaders, and to continue to find solutions to their own problems. The 4th question is, who needs to be at this table? Are we doing with? Are we doing for? And I want to encourage you to never let that question go. And I've been working for more than 20 years, and I want to tell you, there are some days when I really hate to ask that question. I was in a meeting abroad this summer. People were talking about kind of intensive strategies to change the face of global philanthropy, and it was a really important meeting, a lot of very important people around the table. And the facilitator said, does anybody have kind of a question that they want to throw on the table before we break for lunch? I kind of raised my hand. I was like, what would your grantees say if they were here? And it was like a pin could drop in that room. And that, I felt comfortable doing that today. It's not always going to be comfortable to do, but I encourage you to ask that question often. Who else needs to be here? Are we speaking for somebody? Could they speak for themselves? And last, how do you set a table so that everyone is there, elbow to elbow, potluck style? Potluck actually comes from a native word, potlatch, which was designed to bring people together to reciprocate wealth in that community. And all that we've been talking about here, all that I've been talking about here, really imagines knowing how to set a table where people are welcome, where everyone is valued, where people feel equal and able to contribute. And so I want to leave you with a story about a friend of mine. Her name is Ann Roosevelt. She tells a great story about how she learned the importance of setting a table. She told this at a speech not too long ago in Chicago. It was a lecture about diversity and inclusiveness, and so she kind of threw people when she started this whole long story about a table. But I'm going to tell you because it's a good story. She says that one of her fondest memories of being at her grandmother's house when she was growing up was being at the table for dinner. The kids were always included, no matter that she was young, no matter what assorted group of people, powerful and ordinary, was present. All the grown-ups were there talking about grown-up things. There was always a place for her at the table, right there with the adults. She was made to feel welcome. If she didn't say something, her grandmother would ask her what she thought, and she would delight in whatever the answer was. She deliberately engaged and affirmed everyone at that table equally. She told this story as a parable for her work as a grant maker, and it has stayed with me. I often think about the importance of setting a table that has a place for everyone. They are invited and indeed expected to share. It is a particular art to practice giving this way, with grace and openness, to be welcoming and curious and engaged, to be inclusive by design, and to be open to being delighted and changed because of it. It is an extraordinary gift that Anne took from her extraordinary grandmother. Her grandmother, of course, was Eleanor Roosevelt, and it is the gift that I want to leave with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. All right. We have time for a few questions. The volunteers are circling the audience. Okay, there's one in the back. Please identify yourself. Todd.
Hi,
Todd.
I'm Todd.
Hi.
I'm a Clinton School student here, and I really appreciate the statement. Oh, thanks for coming, by the way.
It's my pleasure.
Start by saying that. I really appreciate this. You talked about suspension of judgment, and I think that's important for grant makers to remember. How do you balance that suspension of judgment? And the story you told about the $20,000 going out without any strings attached is for someone that used to be a grant maker is like I just stepped off a cliff. You know? How do you manage how do you manage evaluation and accountability when you do something like that when you make grants? Because you do have to report back. At some point, there's a reality where you have to talk to some stakeholder about the money you invested.
Of course, and there are rules, right? I mean, so you can't give $20,000 and find that people have, spent it on $1,000, whatever, China for their table. Let me tell you a different story in answer to your question. After Katrina, it wiped out all of the infrastructure, right? So there were no phones, there were no computers, there were no fax machines, and grant makers were trying to do a lot to get money on the ground in that community. One of the things that they discovered, and this actually comes from the Ms. Foundation, they told me this story, is that they could pick up the phone, find out if somebody actually had a bona fide IRS determination letter, find out from someone if they were doing the work that they said they were doing, and send a grant. And trust, because they were verified by somebody that they knew on the ground, that the work was going to be okay. And that when they could, they would get a report back from that grantee. I mean, the rules for grant making technically they're very clear, but there are very few of them. And each grant maker sets its rules, and so that community foundation had its rules about, the places that it would fund, and it gave not to some unknown entity, but it gave to a group of people that it knew. And so I think that trust and a prior relationship really matter in that sort of thing. I don't think that grant makers kind of give $20,000 to someone that they've never met before, in the same way that I think we would all feel a little skittish about someone asking you for a loan that you didn't know. But you know people, and you trust them, and you've got some experience with them, you're more willing to trust their judgment. And so I think that's how that works that's how I've seen it work in the land of grant making, where people make those kinds of allowances for grantees because they trust them. And they trust that they know what they're doing. They trust that they have deep experience on the ground that will allow them to make the right decisions. And then they ask for reporting back that allows them to learn from that experience.
Other questions from the audience? Yes.
My name is Dewi. I'm the Clinton School student 2011, so I'm the new batch, and I'm from Indonesia. Thank you for giving such inspiring stories and speech. But I'm very interested in the six kind of the giving, and I think that it's very great way to give. But I think it only work when you work with the community that they already empowered them. They already feel empowered, because like for instance in Indonesian cases, many of the challenge working with the poor is that they think themselves as poor, they cannot do anything and they cannot give anything. And they are not equal to the donors or everyone who give away the charity or the money. And then also the issues is some of the organizations only come to the community, like do some magic thing and then they left. And they don't leave community as the sustainability of the leadership. So my question is that how to accelerate and empower the community so they can, when they are invited to sit on the table, they are able to speak. And they're able to be brave to address their needs. Thank you.
No, it's a great question, and I think that there are a number of foundations, and I want you to ask that question of Suzanne when she comes. Suzanne has worked globally at the Ford Foundation. She's here next week, and part of the work of that foundation, and many like it, are really aimed at this question that you've raised. And the women's foundations are also true. There are a number of places across the country, in this country and abroad, that are focused on building up civil society. That's kind of the necessary foundation, I hate to use the word, but it's a necessary foundation before the rest of this can happen, that helps people to imagine their own agency, to see themselves as being empowered, and to put either the structures in place that lead to them being empowered or help them organize for that. And that is a precursor for this sort of work. At the same time, there are a number of examples where even the smallest sort of giving circles. I mean, I'm reminded of any number of organizations both in the US who give money back to their home countries, as well as kind of local home countries that have picked up this idea of giving circles. If you look on the Women's Funding Network site, there are circles in all parts of Southeast Asia, all over Africa, all over South America, where women will pool together $10. And that $10 is enough to lead them to the next step of change. And so I think it's a combination of both things, but you're right to identify civil society as really one of the necessary things that has to happen before this work can really take root. But then, those outside organizations that come in, I hope come in with this mindset that I've described, that says, we're here to kind of give and to act upon and act with, but also to build so that when we leave, we're leaving behind a community that has a better sense of its own agency and its own institutions in place to continue what we started. I think kind of all of those things are necessary.
Other questions from the audience? Yes. Mike is on the way.
Just in terms of affirmation of both the need and the response, I'm with Heifer International, which actually does very grassroots programming. So many of the groups that we start, and it's a sustainable model, and many of the groups that we start with, and particularly the example I want to use is in Nepal, lots of them women's groups start from this kind of base, totally empowered. And so we do community development with them, but what is most impressive is exactly how quickly an indigenous community can move toward that giving, and indeed starting with so little, because some of those women start, when you talk about a giving circle, of giving a handful of rice, and collect their rice and sell it, and within and they are building and adding within that community, and within such a short period of time, then bringing in those other resources, whether they're governmental or philanthropic, to that organization. So that type of empowerment is not necessarily, being unempowered is not a barrier, because they can move so quickly from that to being able to really develop and manage their own funds. And if they can do it, certainly the indigenous communities here should.
That's our last question, so thank you. Let's give another round of applause to Kristen.